The security camera footage lasted exactly 47 seconds before Officer Nolan Merrow's baton came down on 16-year-old Jasmine Mercer's skull, sending her crashing into the blood-splattered linoleum of Roosevelt High School's main hallway. What happened next would expose 3 generations of police brutality, bring down an entire department, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon against corruption isn't a gun or a protest sign. It's a mother who refuses to let them bury the truth. I invite you to follow this story to the end and comment below which city you're watching from so I can see how far our stories travel. The morning of October 15th started like any other at Roosevelt High School. Students shuffled through the main entrance, backpacks heavy with textbooks, conversations flowing about weekend plans and upcoming tests. The smell of cafeteria breakfast, scrambled eggs, and burnt toast drifted through the hallways. Nobody paid attention to the 2 police officers stationed near the principal's office. They'd become as much a fixture of the school as the faded motivational posters and scratched lockers. Jasmine Mercer walked through those doors at 7:43 a.m. Her purple hoodie pulled up against the autumn chill that seeped through the building's ancient heating system. She was thinking about her chemistry test third period, mentally reviewing molecular formulas while navigating the crowded hallway. Her best friend Keisha had saved her a seat in first period English, and Jasmine was already running 5 minutes late. "Hood off!" a voice commanded. Jasmine barely registered it at first. The school's dress code policy about hoods and hats was enforced so randomly that most students had learned to ignore the occasional bark from security. She kept walking. "I said hood off!" The voice was closer now, harder. This time Jasmine turned. Officer Nolan Merrow stood 3 feet behind her, his hand already resting on his baton. At 6'3", he towered over the 16-year-old's 5'4" frame. His partner, Officer Derek Hutchinson, lingered near the water fountain, watching with the practiced disinterest of someone who'd witnessed this routine before. "I'm just walking to class," Jasmine said, her voice steady but cautious. She'd been raised by her mother Lorraine to be respectful but firm, to know her rights but pick her battles. "It's cold in here." "School policy. Hood comes off or you come with me." Merrow's pale blue eyes held no warmth, no recognition that he was talking to a child. To him, Jasmine was just another name on an unwritten list, another opportunity to assert the authority his badge granted him. The hallway had begun to slow around them. Students pretended to check their phones or dig through lockers, but their peripheral attention was locked on the developing scene. Marcus Williams, a senior who'd been documenting police interactions at the school for a YouTube channel that had gained modest local attention, quietly pulled out his phone and hit record. "I'll take it off when I get to class," Jasmine offered, trying to defuse the situation. "It's literally 20 feet away." "Now!" Merrow stepped closer, close enough that Jasmine could smell the stale coffee on his breath. See the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. A scar his father, retired Officer Thomas Merrow, had given him during a training exercise when he was 12. Though Nolan would later tell people it was from a suspect who resisted arrest. Jasmine reached up slowly, her fingers finding the edge of her hood. But something in Merrow's expression, a flicker of disappointment that she was complying, made her pause. She'd seen that look before on the faces of boys who threw rocks at stray cats hoping for a reaction. The look of someone who wanted an excuse. "Actually," Jasmine said, her voice gaining strength from somewhere deep within, from generations of women who'd been told to bow their heads and had finally said no. "The student handbook says hoods can be worn in hallways if the temperature is below 60 degrees. Maintenance hasn't fixed the heat in 3 weeks. I know my rights." The hallway fell completely silent. Even the freshman who'd been struggling with his jammed locker froze mid-pull. Everyone knew Jasmine was right. They'd all been complaining about the cold for weeks, wearing layers and hoods and whatever else they could to stay warm. But being right and being safe were 2 very different things when Officer Merrow was involved. "Rights." Merrow's thin lips pulled back in what might have been a smile if smiles could be weapons. "You want to talk about rights?" His hand moved faster than anyone expected. Not to his baton first, but to Jasmine's shoulder, spinning her around with such force that her backpack flew off, spilling textbooks and pencils across the floor. Her chemistry notes, the ones she'd spent 3 hours preparing the night before, scattered like fallen leaves. "Don't touch me!" Jasmine tried to pull away, but Merrow's grip was iron. His fingers dug into her shoulder hard enough to leave bruises that would later be documented as evidence item number 4 in the case that would destroy him. "Resisting an officer," Merrow announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone who'd said these words many times before. "Hutchinson, you seeing this?" Hutchinson shifted uncomfortably by the water fountain. At 24, he was still new enough to feel the wrongness of what was happening, but too afraid of Merrow's connections to intervene. His father worked in sanitation. Merrow's father had been deputy chief. The math was simple. "Just let her go to class, Merrow," a voice called out. Ms. Patricia Williams, the AP history teacher, stood in her doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and carefully controlled anger. She'd taught at Roosevelt for 15 years, had seen too many scenes like this play out. "She's one of my best students. There's no need for—" "Ma'am, please return to your classroom." Merrow cut her off without even looking at her. "This is a police matter now." The words, "police matter," transformed the moment. What had been a dispute over a hood became something official. Something that would generate reports and documentation and all the bureaucratic weight that came with those two words. Ms. Williams hesitated, her eyes meeting Jasmine's for a brief moment. An apology, a promise to call Jasmine's mother, a lifetime of similar moments, all compressed into a single look before she stepped back into her classroom and quietly closed the door. "Please," Jasmine said. And she hated how small her voice sounded, how the word "please" tasted like surrender in her mouth. "I just want to go to class. I have a test." "Should have thought about that before you decided to be non-compliant," Merrow said, reaching for his handcuffs. "Turn around, hands behind your back." "For a hood?" Jasmine's voice cracked with disbelief. "You're arresting me for wearing a hood." The slap happened so fast that Marcus Williams, still recording from 30 feet away, would later have to slow the footage down frame by frame to capture it. Merrow's open palm connected with the side of Jasmine's face, snapping her head to the right, sending her stumbling into the lockers. The metallic bang echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. "Now you're under arrest for assault," Merrow said calmly, as if Jasmine had been the one to throw the first blow. "You all saw her swing at me." Nobody had seen that because it hadn't happened, but Merrow's eyes swept the hallway with the confidence of someone who knew fear was a better silencer than any gag. Students looked away, suddenly fascinated by their shoes, their phones, anything but the girl with the growing red mark on her cheek being pressed against the lockers. "I didn't—" Jasmine started to protest, but Merrow's baton was already in his hand. The first strike caught her in the ribs, driving the air from her lungs in a rush that sounded like a punctured balloon. She doubled over, gasping, and the second strike found her shoulder, sending lightning bolts of pain down her arm. The third strike, the one that would replay in news broadcasts for weeks to come, connected with the side of her head just above her left ear. Jasmine's knees buckled. She fell forward, catching herself on her hands for a moment, before Merrow's boot found her lower back, driving her flat against the floor. Her cheek pressed against the cold linoleum, and she could see dust bunnies under the lockers, a forgotten pencil, someone's lost earring. Such ordinary things in such an extraordinary moment. "Stop!" someone screamed. Later, 3 different students would claim it was them, each wanting to be the one who'd tried to help. But in the moment, the voice was anonymous, disembodied, as useful as shouting at a hurricane. Merrow brought the baton down again, this time on Jasmine's extended hand. The crack of breaking fingers was audible, even over the growing chorus of horrified gasps. Jasmine screamed a sound that would haunt everyone who heard it, the kind of sound that made Marcus Williams' hand shake as he tried to keep his phone steady, the kind of sound that made 2 freshman girls start crying without fully understanding why. "Get that camera out of here!" Hutchinson finally spoke, moving toward Marcus with sudden purpose, as if action in any direction might absolve him of his inaction where it mattered. No recording on school property. Marcus tried to protest, but Hutchinson was already grabbing for his phone. In the struggle, the recording stopped at exactly 47 seconds. By the time Marcus managed to start recording again, Jasmine was unconscious, blood pooling beneath her head in a slowly expanding circle that looked black against the white linoleum. "Call an ambulance," someone said. "Everyone back to class," Marrow commanded, not even breathing hard, his baton still in his hand. A drop of blood, Jasmine's blood, had splattered across his badge, and he wiped it away with his thumb, as casually as someone might brush away a speck of dust. Show's over. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The principal, Dr. Harold Morrison, emerged from his office where he'd been hiding, though he'd later claim he'd been on an important phone call with the district superintendent. His face was the color of spoiled milk as he took in the scene, and unconscious student blood on the floor, crying teenagers, and Officer Marrow standing over it all like a conquering general. "What happened here?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to know. "Student assaulted an officer," Marrow said simply. "Had to subdue her. Going to need that security footage from the cameras." He pointed to the 2 security cameras that covered this section of the hallway, the ones that should have captured everything. Morrison nodded quickly, already calculating the damage control needed, the calls to the district office, the carefully worded statements that would need to be prepared. He'd been principal for 6 years, had learned that the path of least resistance when it came to the police presence in his school was simply to resist nothing at all. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later, though it felt like hours to the students pressed against classroom windows, watching as paramedics carefully placed Jasmine on a backboard, her body limp as a rag doll. Someone had called her mother. Ms. Williams had slipped out of her classroom to make the call from her personal cell phone, knowing the official channels would delay or dilute the information. Lorraine Mercer was in the middle of her shift at Riverside Medical Center, where she worked as a registered nurse in the emergency department when the call came. She'd been inserting an IV into an elderly patient, her hands steady, despite having been on her feet for 10 hours already, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Ms. Mercer? This is Patricia Williams from Roosevelt High. There's been an incident with Jasmine." The words that followed blurred together police ambulance unconscious, but Lorraine heard enough. She turned to her supervisor, said simply, "My daughter," and was out the door before anyone could respond. Her hands shook as she ran to her car, muscle memory from years of emergency training, warring with a mother's panic. She knew which hospital they'd take Jasmine to St. Mary's was closest to the school, and she drove there with the kind of controlled recklessness that only someone familiar with trauma could manage. Red lights became suggestions. Stop signs became yields. The normal rules of the road ceased to apply because her daughter, her baby girl, was hurt. When she arrived at St. Mary's emergency department, she found organized chaos. Jasmine had been rushed directly into trauma bay, and Lorraine could see through the glass doors the controlled frenzy of medical professionals working on her daughter. She recognized the movements, the urgency. This wasn't a minor injury. "I'm her mother," Lorraine said to the desk nurse, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "Lorraine Mercer. I work at Riverside. What's her status?" The nurse, young blonde, clearly overwhelmed, looked at her computer screen. They're still evaluating. Head trauma. The doctor will..." But Lorraine was already pushing through the doors, her hospital ID from Riverside still clipped to her scrubs, giving her an air of authority that nobody questioned in the moment. She made it 3 steps before security stopped her. "Ma'am, you can't..." "That's my daughter." The words came out as half scream, half sob, and suddenly all of Lorraine's professional composure crumbled. "Please, that's my baby." Dr. James Martinez, the attending physician, looked up from where he was examining Jasmine's pupils with a penlight. He recognized the look in Lorraine's eyes. He'd seen it in countless parents. But there was something else there too. The knowledge of someone who understood exactly how bad this could be. "Let her in," he said quietly. "But stay back, Lorraine. Let us work." Lorraine pressed herself against the wall, watching as they worked on her daughter. Jasmine's face was swollen, almost beyond recognition. Her left eye completely shut. Purple bruises already forming along her jaw. Her left hand was clearly broken, fingers bent at unnatural angles. But it was the stillness that terrified Lorraine most. Jasmine had always been in motion, always dancing or walking or gesturing as she talked. This stillness was wrong. Subdural hematoma, Dr. Martinez said to his team examining the CT scan results that had just come through. "We need to get her to surgery now. Call neuro, tell them we're coming up." As they wheeled Jasmine toward the elevator, Lorraine caught her daughter's hand, the unbroken one, and squeezed it gently. "I'm here, baby. Mama's here." There was no response. The waiting room during surgery became Lorraine's purgatory. She sat in a hard plastic chair, still in her scrubs from her shift blood. Someone else's blood from her last patient still under her fingernails. Other families came and went, their dramas playing out in whispered conversations and barely controlled tears, but Lorraine remained frozen, stuck in a loop of memory and fear. She thought about Jasmine as a baby, how she'd been born 3 weeks early, but came out fighting, screaming loud enough that the delivery nurse had laughed and said, "This one's got something to say." She thought about Jasmine at 5, insisting on wearing her Halloween costume, a doctor like mommy, to school every day for a month. Jasmine at 10, organizing a fundraiser for the animal shelter, going door to door with handmade flyers, and a determination that reminded Lorraine of herself. Jasmine at 16 this morning, kissing her mother goodbye as she rushed out the door, complaining about the cold, saying she'd wear her hood until they fixed the heat. "Ms. Mercer." Lorraine looked up to find 2 police officers standing before her, not Merrow and Hutchinson, but 2 she didn't recognize. The older one, a black woman with sergeant stripes, had the kind of face that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "I'm Sergeant Angela Foster. This is Officer Ryan Chen. We need to ask you some questions about the incident at Roosevelt High." The incident. Lorraine stood slowly, her exhaustion transforming into something sharper. "Is that what you're calling it? My daughter is in surgery with a brain bleed and you're calling it an incident." Sergeant Foster's expression didn't change. "We need to understand what happened. Your daughter was reportedly non-compliant with..." Non-compliant. The word tasted like poison in Lorraine's mouth. She's 16 years old. She was walking to class. What could she possibly have done that justified this? "According to Officer Merrow's report, your daughter assaulted..." "Stop." Lorraine held up her hand. "Just stop. I know how this goes. I know the words you use, the way you frame things. Non-compliant, resisting, assault on an officer. I've heard it all before." And she had, though Sergeant Foster couldn't know that. 20 years ago, when Lorraine was 22 and 7 months pregnant with Jasmine, she'd had her own encounter with the Merrow family. Not Nolan, but his father, Thomas Merrow, then a senior officer with a reputation for being tough on crime, which in their neighborhood meant tough on anyone who looked like Lorraine. She'd been walking home from her job at a grocery store, exhausted, feet swollen, counting the days until maternity leave. Officer Thomas Merrow had stopped her, claiming she matched a description of someone who'd shoplifted from a store she'd never been to. When she'd protested, when she'd tried to explain she was coming from work, had her work vest in her bag, to prove it, he'd grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises, twisted it behind her back, despite her pregnant belly, and arrested her for resisting. She'd spent 8 hours in holding before a public defender got her released. The charges were dropped, but the message had been clear: people like the Merrows could do what they wanted to people like her. The bruises on her arm had faded, but the memory hadn't. She'd never told Jasmine about it, had tried to raise her daughter to see the world as it could be rather than as it was. "Ma'am." Officer Chen spoke for the first time, his voice softer than his partner's. "We're just trying to get all the facts. There were witnesses, video footage." Video footage. Lorraine's attention sharpened. You have video. Foster and Chen exchanged a look that told Lorraine everything she needed to know. The school's security system experienced a malfunction, Foster said carefully. The cameras in that section of the hallway weren't recording. How convenient. Lorraine sat back down, suddenly exhausted again. The cameras just happened to malfunction right when Officer Marrow beat my daughter unconscious. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation, it's what happened. Lorraine looked directly at Foster. You know it, I know it, and everyone at that school knows it. The only question is whether anyone's going to do anything about it. Foster's jaw tightened slightly, a crack in her professional facade. If you have evidence, a student was recording. Marcus Williams. Check his phone. We've already spoken to Mr. Williams. His phone was damaged in an altercation with Officer Hutchinson. The video was corrupted. Lorraine laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course it was. Every camera, every phone, every piece of evidence just mysteriously fails when the police are involved. Must be some kind of technical curse that only affects recordings of police brutality. Before Foster could respond, Dr. Martinez emerged from the elevator, still in his surgical scrubs. His expression made Lorraine's heart stop. She's stable, he said quickly, recognizing the look of terror on Lorraine's face. We were able to relieve the pressure, stop the bleeding, but... He paused, choosing his words carefully. She's in a coma. The brain injury was severe. We won't know the extent of the damage until she wakes up. When will that be? Lorraine asked, though she already knew the answer from her years of medical experience. We don't know. It could be days, weeks, longer. I'm sorry. The police officers started to speak, but Lorraine was already walking away, following Dr. Martinez to the ICU, where her daughter lay surrounded by machines that breathed for her, monitored her, kept her alive. Jasmine looked small in the hospital bed, dwarfed by the equipment, her face still swollen and bruised. The steady beep of the heart monitor was both reassuring and terrifying proof of life, but also of its fragility. Lorraine pulled a chair next to the bed and took Jasmine's unbroken hand in both of hers. I'm here, baby, she whispered. I'm not going anywhere. For the next 3 days, Lorraine didn't leave the hospital. Friends brought her changes of clothes, food. She didn't eat words of comfort that didn't comfort. The official story had already begun to circulate. Jasmine Mercer, a troubled student with a history of disciplinary issues, she had one detention for being late, after helping a freshman who'd gotten locked in a bathroom, had attacked Officer Marrow, who had been forced to defend himself. The school district released a statement expressing concern while emphasizing their zero-tolerance policy for violence against school resource officers. The police department announced an internal investigation that would be thorough and unbiased, led by Captain Richard Marrow, Nolan's uncle. But in the hallways of Roosevelt High, a different story was being told. Students whispered about what they'd really seen, shared screenshots of Marcus Williams' corrupted video, 47 seconds, that showed Jasmine being slammed against the lockers before the phone was knocked away. They drew pictures of Jasmine on notebook paper and taped them to their lockers. Someone spray-painted "Justice for Jasmine" on the gymnasium wall. Marcus Williams, devastated that his video had been destroyed, spent every free moment trying to recover the footage. He reached out to tech-savvy friends posted in forums, even contacted a data recovery service that quoted him a price he couldn't afford. The guilt ate at him if he'd just backed up the video immediately, if he'd live-streamed instead of recording, if he'd stood further back where Hutchinson couldn't reach him. Ms. Patricia Williams, no relation to Marcus, was called into Principal Morrison's office on day 2. Patricia, I understand you were a witness to the incident. Morrison said, his hands folded on his desk, like a man about to pray or plead. I saw Officer Marrow attack a student without provocation, Patricia said clearly. I'd be happy to provide a written statement to that effect. Morrison's face tightened. That's not what Officer Marrow's report indicates, and given the lack of video evidence, it would be your word against a police officer's. Then I guess my word will have to be enough. Patricia, Morrison's voice took on what he probably thought was a fatherly tone. "You've been here 15 years. You're up for department head next year. It would be a shame if this situation were to affect that opportunity." Patricia stood up slowly. "Are you threatening me, Harold?" "I'm trying to protect you, to protect all of us. The police union is very powerful. Officer Merrow's family has deep connections. Going against them, it wouldn't just affect you, it could affect the whole school, our funding, our security, our students' safety." "Our students' safety." Patricia laughed bitterly. "One of our students is in a coma because of Officer Merrow. How much less safe could they be?" She left without being dismissed, but she knew Morrison was right about one thing: the Merrow family did have deep connections. Thomas Merrow might have been retired, but he still had lunch with the chief of police every Tuesday. His brother Richard was captain of the Northeast Precinct. His other son David was a prosecutor in the district attorney's office. They were a law enforcement dynasty in a city where such dynasties meant more than law and more than enforcement. On the fourth day, as Lorraine sat reading to Jasmine from her favorite book, The Hate You Give, which seemed both appropriate and heartbreaking, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. A friend." Lorraine almost ignored it, assuming it was spam, but something made her look. In her inbox was a single email with no subject line, containing only a link to a cloud storage folder. Inside the folder were dozens of files: police reports, personnel records, complaint forms spanning 20 years. Thomas Merrow had 37 excessive force complaints over his career, all dismissed or settled quietly. Nolan Merrow, in just 6 years on the force, had already accumulated 12. There were patterns: young black students, minor infractions escalated to violence cameras that mysteriously malfunctioned. There were names, dates, hospital records that had been sealed but somehow found their way into this folder. And there was one name that made Lorraine's blood run cold, her own from 20 years ago. The report from her arrest, but not the sanitized version that had been filed officially. This was Thomas Merrow's personal notes, including comments about teaching another welfare queen a lesson about how pregnant black women thought they could use their condition to avoid consequences. But most damning was a photo timestamp from 3 days ago, 2 hours after Jasmine had been brought to the hospital. It showed officers Nolan Merrow and Derek Hutchinson in the security office at Roosevelt High. Hutchinson at the computer, Merrow standing behind him. The next photo, taken 30 seconds later, showed the computer screen clearly. Deleting security footage. Hallway camera 3, October 15, 7:48:00 a.m. Lorraine stared at the photos, her hands trembling. Someone inside the system had documented this, had risked everything to get her this information. She thought about the sergeant who'd questioned her, Angela Foster, and the way her jaw had tightened when Lorraine mentioned the convenient camera malfunction. A friend, indeed. She looked at Jasmine, still unconscious, machines still breathing for her, and made a decision. If the system wanted to play dirty, she could play dirty too. But she'd play smart. First, she made copies of everything uploaded to multiple cloud services, saved on USB drives she gave to trusted friends, even printed hard copies that she stored in a safety deposit box. She'd learned from Marcus Williams' mistake. This evidence would not disappear. Then she called Alexis Thompson, a civil rights attorney who'd made a name for herself taking on police brutality cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. Thompson had grown up in the same neighborhood as Lorraine, had gotten out through scholarships and sheer determination, but hadn't forgotten where she came from. "Lorraine, I heard about Jasmine. I'm so sorry. I have evidence, Alexis. Not just about what happened to Jasmine. 20 years of evidence. The Merrows, the whole department. How soon can you get here?" There was a pause then. "I'm on my way." While she waited for Alexis, Lorraine opened her laptop and began to write. Not a legal document or a formal complaint, but a story. A mother's story about her daughter. The girl who organized fundraisers and got one detention for helping another student who knew her rights and stood up for them, who was now lying in a coma because she wore a hood on a cold day. She wrote about the patterns she saw in the files, how complaints against the Merrows always came from the same neighborhoods, the same schools, the same demographic. She wrote about the blue wall of silence that protected officers like Nolan Merrow, while failing to protect children like Jasmine. She wrote about her own encounter 20 years ago, and how she'd stayed silent, hoping to protect her unborn child from a system that seemed designed to destroy them both. When Alexis arrived, Lorraine showed her everything. The attorney's expression grew darker with each document she reviewed, each photo she examined. This is huge, Lorraine. This isn't just about Jasmine. This is systemic, generational. I know. Lorraine looked at her daughter still motionless in the hospital bed. The question is, what do we do with it? We could file a federal civil rights lawsuit. With this evidence, that would take years, and they'd bury it in legal procedures settlements with no admission of guilt. Nothing would change. Alexis studied her old friend. You have something else in mind. I want the world to see this. All of it. Not filtered through press releases or carefully worded statements. I want them to see what the Merrows have done, what the department has covered up, what happens when you give violent men badges and tell them they're above the law. If we release this publicly before filing charges, it could compromise. I don't care about money. I don't even care about jail time for Merrow because we both know that probably won't happen. I care about change, real change, the kind that only comes when people can't look away anymore. Alexis was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Okay, but we do this smart. We need media contacts, social media strategy, community organizers. This has to be coordinated or they'll spin it as a desperate mother making wild accusations. Over the next week, while Jasmine remained in her coma, Lorraine and Alexis built their case in public, rather than in court. They reached out to investigative journalists, providing them with portions of the evidence enough to verify the authenticity and start their own investigations. They connected with local activists who'd been fighting police brutality for years, giving them ammunition they'd never had before. Marcus Williams, when he learned about the recovered evidence, became their most passionate advocate among the students. He organized walkouts, teach-ins, and protests. He created social media campaigns that trended nationally. The 47 seconds of video he'd managed to capture, corrupted as it was, became a rallying cry. Proof that even partial truth was powerful enough to shake foundations. The school tried to suppress the student movement. Principal Morrison banned gatherings of more than 5 students, prohibited signs and flyers about Jasmine, and threatened suspension for anyone participating in walkouts. But the students had learned something from watching Jasmine stand up to Officer Merrow. Sometimes being right was more important than being safe. They renamed the hallway where the attack happened, Justice Hall, using chalk to write it on the floor every morning, even though janitors washed it away every night. They wore purple hoodies, like the one Jasmine had worn in silent solidarity. They created a memorial wall in the bathroom, where the school couldn't tear it down without entering student privacy. The breaking point came when a local news station obtained and aired the photos of Merrow and Hutchinson, deleting the security footage. The images were grainy, but clear enough, 2 police officers destroying evidence of their own crime. The police department tried to claim the photos were doctored, but their own IT department confirmed the deletion logs matched the timestamps. Officer Derek Hutchinson cracked first. The weight of what he'd participated in, combined with the public pressure and the knowledge that he'd been photographed destroying evidence, broke his resolve. He reached out to Alexis Thompson through his own lawyer, offering to testify in exchange for immunity. His testimony was damning. He described how Merrow had targeted Jasmine specifically because she was known for being outspoken about student rights. How Merrow had bragged about his father teaching him to handle troublemakers. How the deletion of the security footage had been planned before they even left the school that day. How Captain Richard Merrow had personally assured them that the investigation would find no wrongdoing. I knew it was wrong, Hutchinson said in his recorded deposition, his voice hollow with shame. But Officer Merrow said this was how things worked, that this was how we maintained order. that if students like Jasmine thought they could challenge authority without consequences, we'd lose control of the schools entirely. The deposition was leaked. Lorraine never admitted to being the source, though the timing was suspicious, and within hours, it was everywhere. National news picked it up. Civil rights organizations descended on the city. The FBI announced they were opening an investigation into the entire police department. But for Lorraine sitting beside her daughter's bed for the 20th day, none of it felt like victory. Jasmine was still unconscious, still breathing through machines, still silent in a way that broke Lorraine's heart fresh each morning. "The whole world knows now, baby," Lorraine whispered, holding Jasmine's hand. "They know what happened to you. They know who did it. Things are changing because of you. But I'd trade it all just to hear your voice again." It was day 23 when Officer Nolan Marrow was finally arrested. Not by his colleagues in the local department they'd refused, but by federal agents executing a warrant for civil rights violations and destruction of evidence. The image of him being led away in handcuffs past a crowd of Roosevelt High students in purple hoodies became iconic. But it was his expression that people remembered, not shame or regret, but rage at being held accountable. Captain Richard Marrow resigned the next day, claiming he wanted to avoid being a distraction from the important work of the police department. Thomas Marrow, the patriarch of the family, gave an interview to a conservative news outlet claiming his family was being persecuted for doing their jobs, that Jasmine Mercer was a thug who'd gotten what she deserved. That interview was playing on the hospital room television when it happened. Lorraine had stepped out for the first time in hours, desperate for coffee and fresh air. When she returned, the nurse was standing by Jasmine's bed with tears in her eyes. "She squeezed my hand," the nurse said. "When that man on TV said those things about her, her hand moved and she squeezed mine." Lorraine flew to the bedside, taking Jasmine's hand. "Baby Jasmine, can you hear me?" For a long moment, nothing. Then slowly, impossibly, Jasmine's eyes fluttered open. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. Enough to see her mother's face, enough to squeeze her hand with intention rather than reflex. "Mom." The word was barely a whisper, rough from weeks of silence, but it was the most beautiful sound Lorraine had ever heard. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." Jasmine's recovery was slow, painful, and incomplete. The brain injury had affected her motor skills on her left side. Her broken hand healed imperfectly, despite multiple surgeries. She struggled with memory gaps, with finding words that had once come easily. The girl who'd planned to study pre-med, who'd gotten straight A's, now needed months of rehabilitation just to walk without assistance. But she was alive, she was awake, and she was angry. "I want to testify," she told Alexis Thompson during one of their first meetings. "I want to tell everyone what really happened." "Jasmine, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. They tried to erase me. The video, the reports, everything. They wanted me to disappear. But I'm still here." The trial of Nolan Marrow became a national spectacle. The prosecution, led by a federal team that had taken over from the compromised local district attorney's office, presented the evidence methodically. The photos of the deleted footage, Hutchinson's testimony, the pattern of abuse documented over 20 years, and finally, Jasmine herself. She walked into the courtroom slowly, still using a cane, her left hand still showing the damage from Marrow's baton. But her voice was strong as she described that morning, the cold hallway, the hood she'd worn for warmth, the officer who'd seen her as a threat for simply existing while black. "He smiled," she said, looking directly at Marrow. "When he hit me the first time, he smiled, like he enjoyed it, like this was what he'd been waiting for." Marrow's defense attorney tried to paint her as aggressive, non-compliant, a troubled teen who'd forced an officer to defend himself. But the 47 seconds of video, enhanced and analyzed by federal experts, showed the truth: a girl backing away, trying to comply, being brutalized by a man twice her size. During a break in the trial, as Jasmine sat in the courthouse cafeteria with her mother and Alexis, a woman approached their table. She was older, maybe 60, walking with the careful dignity of someone carrying old pain. "Excuse me," she said softly. I'm Dorothy Chen. In 1987, Thomas Merrow broke my son's arm during an arrest. My son was 14. The charges were dropped, but... She pulled out a faded photograph of a young boy in a cast. I've carried this for 37 years, waiting for someone to finally stop them. Thank you. She wasn't the only one. As the trial continued, more people came forward. Parents, siblings, survivors of the Merrow family's reign of terror. Each with their own story, their own scars, their own 47 seconds that had never been recorded. The verdict came down on a Thursday afternoon in February, 4 months after Jasmine had first opened her eyes in that hospital bed. Guilty on all counts: assault, civil rights violations, destruction of evidence, conspiracy. Nolan Merrow would serve 25 years in federal prison, no possibility of early release for 15. It should have felt like victory. But as Lorraine watched them lead him away, all she could think about was how her daughter still couldn't write, with her left hand, still woke up screaming from nightmares, still flinched when she saw police officers on the street. "It's not enough," Jasmine said quietly, gripping her cane as they left the courthouse. 25 years for stealing my whole life. But the conviction had started something that couldn't be stopped. The FBI investigation into the police department expanded, uncovering decades of corruption that went far beyond the Merrow family. Officers who'd remained silent out of fear began to speak. Documents that had been hidden surfaced. The blue wall of silence, once impenetrable, began to crack and crumble. Dorothy Chen became a regular visitor to the Mercer home, bringing soup and stories, creating an unexpected family, born from shared trauma. She taught Jasmine exercises to strengthen her damaged hand techniques she'd learned helping her own son recover 37 years ago. Sometimes they would sit in silence, 2 generations united by the violence of violent men finding comfort in not having to explain their pain. "My son never got justice," Dorothy told Jasmine one evening as they worked on hand exercises together. "He became an engineer, built a good life, but he never forgot. He still can't fully extend his arm. Some wounds don't heal, they just become part of who we are." Marcus Williams had transformed his guilt over the corrupted video into action. He'd started a nonprofit called Document Everything, teaching students in marginalized communities how to safely record police interactions, how to immediately back up footage to multiple cloud services, how to live stream when recording might not be enough. His presentations always began with those 47 seconds, grainy and incomplete, but powerful enough to have started a revolution. Jasmine's 47 seconds changed everything, he would tell packed auditoriums of high school students. "Imagine if we'd had the full video. Imagine if every instance of police brutality was recorded, saved, and shared. They rely on our silence, on destroyed evidence, on our fear. We take that away. We take away their power." The Roosevelt High School that Jasmine returned to in March was different from the one she'd left on that October morning. The metal detectors were gone, removed after a school board vote that cited studies showing they created a prison-like atmosphere without actually improving safety. The police substation had been replaced with a counseling center. Officer positions had been converted to social worker positions. The hallway where Jasmine had been attacked now bore a plaque, Justice Hall, in honor of Jasmine Mercer and all students who stand up for their rights. But not everyone celebrated these changes. A group of parents led by a woman named Karen Mitchell, whose son had never experienced police violence and never would organize to demand the return of police officers to the school. "Our children need protection," Mitchell proclaimed at a school board meeting that Jasmine attended, still recovering, still using her cane. "What happens when there's real violence? Who will protect them then?" Jasmine stood slowly, her mother reaching out to steady her. The room fell silent as she made her way to the microphone, each step deliberate, each movement a reminder of what their previous protection had cost. "Mrs. Mitchell." Jasmine began, her voice carrying the kind of authority that only comes from lived experience. "I was a straight-A student. I'd never been in a fight, never threatened anyone, never brought weapons to school. The only violence I experienced at Roosevelt High came from the officer you claim was protecting us. I spent 3 weeks in a coma because I wore a hood on a cold day. 23 days of my mother not knowing if I'd wake up. 4 months of rehabilitation just to walk again. I still can't write with my left hand. I still have gaps in my memory. So please tell me again who exactly Officer Merrow was protecting." Mitchell had no response. How could she? Her son had never been seen as a threat for existing. Her daughter had never been slammed against lockers for wearing winter clothes. Her family had never had to document their child's bruises for evidence, never had to watch security footage mysteriously disappear, never had to fight a system designed to protect their attacker. The school board voted to maintain the new policies. The counseling center stayed. The social workers stayed. The police did not return. But the Merrow family's influence didn't disappear overnight. David Merrow, the prosecutor's son, used his connections to make Lorraine's life difficult in subtle ways. Her parking tickets never got dismissed, even obvious errors. Her property tax assessment mysteriously increased. When she applied for a promotion at the hospital, her background check took 3 times longer than anyone else's, ultimately costing her the position. "They're trying to break us," Lorraine told Alexis Thompson during one of their regular meetings. "They can't come at us directly anymore, so they're using the system death by 1,000 paper cuts." "Document everything," Alexis advised. "Every delayed form, every unusual charge, every mysterious complication. We're building a harassment case." The documentation became Lorraine's second job. She kept meticulous records, took screenshots of every interaction, saved every piece of paper. She learned to navigate bureaucracy like a weapons expert, understanding that forms and procedures could be tools of oppression or resistance, depending on who wielded them. Thomas Merrow, the patriarch, tried one last desperate move. He published a memoir titled "Thin Blue Line: A Family's Service," painting his family as victims of a witch hunt, claiming his son had been sacrificed to appease radical activists. The book was full of lies, half-truths, and dog whistles, but it found an audience among those who believed police could do no wrong. Jasmine read every word of it, annotating the margins with corrections, context, and caustic commentary. When a reporter asked her about it, she simply said, "Mr. Merrow's fiction belongs in the fantasy section." Although even fantasy readers expect better world-building than his collection of racist fairy tales. Her response went viral, leading to a surge in her own social media following. People wanted to hear from her, to understand her experience, to learn from her strength. But Jasmine struggled with the attention. She'd never wanted to be a symbol, a poster child for police brutality. She'd just wanted to go to chemistry class. "I don't know how to be this person everyone expects," she told her mother one night, scrolling through messages from strangers, calling her a hero, an inspiration, a warrior. "I'm just a teenager who got beat up by a cop. I didn't choose this." "No, baby, you didn't." Lorraine agreed, sitting beside her daughter on her bed, the same bed Jasmine had slept in since she was 4, surrounded by the same stuffed animals that had watched her grow up. "But you chose how to respond. You chose to testify. You chose to speak truth. That's what makes you heroic, not what happened to you, but what you did with it." The 1-year anniversary of the attack approached with the weight of an approaching storm. The school wanted to hold a ceremony. The city wanted to issue proclamations. Activists wanted to organize marches. Everyone wanted a piece of Jasmine's trauma to transform her pain into their platform. "I don't want any of it," Jasmine told Ms. Patricia Williams, who'd become something of a mentor since the attack. "I don't want to relive that day with hundreds of people watching. I don't want to give speeches about survival. I just want to be a normal student for once." Patricia understood. She'd watched Jasmine struggle with the weight of unwanted fame, had seen her flinch when well-meaning strangers approached her in public to thank her for her bravery. "What if we did something different?" "Something you choose." That's how Jasmine ended up spending the anniversary in the hospital's pediatric ward, reading to children, playing games, being just another volunteer rather than a symbol. One little girl, maybe 7, with a broken arm from a bike accident, asked Jasmine about her cane. "Did you fall off your bike too?" the girl asked innocently. "Something like that," Jasmine replied, and for the first time in a year, the simplified truth didn't feel like a lie. Meanwhile, the systemic changes continued rippling outward. Other schools in the district removed their police officers. The state legislature passed Jasmine's Law, requiring all school security footage to be automatically backed up to independent servers that couldn't be accessed or deleted by local law enforcement. Police departments across the country had to confront their own Officer Meros, their own dynasties of violence. But change came with backlash. Threats arrived at the Mercer home, anonymous letters, voicemails, packages that had to be checked by federal agents who'd assigned themselves as unofficial protectors. Some came from police sympathizers, others from white supremacists who saw Jasmine as a symbol of everything they hated about the changing world. "We could move," Lorraine suggested one evening after a particularly vicious letter had arrived, containing photos of their house taken from different angles, the implicit threat clear. "Start fresh somewhere new." "No," Jasmine said firmly. "This is our home. This is where I grew up, where I'll graduate, where my friends are. They don't get to take that too. They've taken enough." The trial of Captain Richard Merrow began 6 months after his nephew's conviction. The evidence against him was overwhelming, not just covering up Nolan's crime, but decades of protecting abusive officers, destroying evidence, intimidating witnesses. The corruption ran so deep that federal prosecutors had to bring in judges from other districts, fearing local contamination. During the trial, a witness nobody expected took the stand. Sergeant Angela Foster, the black woman officer who'd questioned Lorraine in the hospital that first day. She revealed she'd been the source of the leaked documents, that she'd spent years documenting the Merrow family's crimes, waiting for the right moment to expose them. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" the prosecutor asked. Foster's answer was simple and devastating. "Because I have 2 daughters. The Merrows made it clear what would happen to them if I ever spoke up. It took Jasmine's courage, a 16-year-old girl standing up to them, to show me that my silence was complicity. I protected my children by allowing other people's children to be hurt. I'll carry that shame forever." Her testimony broke something in the courtroom. Even Merrow's defense attorney seemed affected, stumbling over his cross-examination. The myth of the thin blue line of officers protecting each other out of nobility and brotherhood crumbled in the face of Foster's admission that the silence was born from fear, not loyalty. Richard Merrow was convicted and sentenced to 30 years. As they led him away, he turned to look at Jasmine, who'd attended every day of the trial. His expression wasn't angry anymore, just confused, as if he genuinely couldn't understand how a teenage girl had brought down an empire. Spring came slowly that year, and with it, Jasmine's graduation approached. Her grades had suffered brain injuries, don't care about academic ambitions, but she'd fought for every C, every B, every hard-won A-. The pre-med dreams were on hold, maybe forever, but she'd discovered a passion for law, for justice, for the power of documentation and testimony. "I want to be a civil rights attorney," she told Alexis Thompson during one of their now regular coffee meetings. "Like you, but different. I want to specialize in police brutality cases involving minors. I know what it's like to be young and powerless against someone with a badge. I want to be the advocate I needed." Alexis smiled, seeing in Jasmine not just a client or a victim, but a future colleague. Law school isn't easy, especially with your injuries. Neither was learning to walk again. Neither was testifying against Merrow. Neither was surviving. Jasmine's voice carried steel now, forged in trauma, but shaped by determination. "I'm good at doing things that aren't easy." Graduation day arrived with the kind of perfect weather that felt like a gift. Jasmine walked across the stage slowly, still using her cane, but moving with purpose. When Principal Morrison handed her the diploma, he whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you." She looked him in the eye and said, "Then protect the next one." The crowd erupted when her name was called, not just polite applause, but a standing ovation that went on so long the ceremony had to pause. Students held up purple signs, wore purple ribbons, turned her survival into a celebration. But Jasmine's eyes found her mother in the crowd, Lorraine crying openly. Dorothy Chen beside her, Marcus Williams and Ms. Patricia Williams and Sergeant Foster, and all the people who'd fought alongside them. That evening, at the small family celebration Lorraine had organized, Jasmine pulled her mother aside. "Mom, I need to tell you something." She took a breath, gathering courage. "I know about what happened to you, with Thomas Marrow, when you were pregnant with me." Lorraine froze. "How?" "It was in the files Foster leaked. I saw the report, his notes, everything." Jasmine took her mother's hands, her damaged left hand still weak but present. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I wanted to protect you," Lorraine whispered. "I wanted you to grow up believing the world was better than it is. I thought if I didn't tell you about the poison, you wouldn't have to taste it. But I did anyway, and when I did, I didn't know it was hereditary. I thought I was alone." Jasmine squeezed her mother's hands gently. "We're not alone, Mom. We never were. Dorothy's son, Foster's daughters, all the kids who came before me, and all the ones who'll come after. We're linked by more than trauma. We're linked by survival." That summer, as Jasmine prepared for community college, her brain injury making a traditional 4-year program impossible, for now she started writing. Not legal briefs or police reports, but stories. Her story, her mother's story, Dorothy's son's story, all the stories that had been silenced or erased or corrupted like Marcus's video. The book would take 3 years to finish, interrupted by surgeries and setbacks, by legal consultations and therapy sessions, by the slow work of healing that never quite completes. But when it was published, 47 Seconds, a memoir of police violence and survival, it became more than just a bestseller. It became a textbook in criminal justice programs, a training manual for activists, a beacon for other survivors who'd been told their stories didn't matter. Officer Derek Hutchinson, who'd cooperated with the investigation and testified against his partner, was never charged criminally. But he left law enforcement, became a counselor, working with at-risk youth, trying to balance the scales of his conscience. He reached out to Jasmine once, a long letter of apology that she read but never answered. Some bridges once burned by complicity couldn't be rebuilt with words. The Roosevelt High School hallway where everything happened became an unofficial pilgrimage site. Students from other schools, other states came to see Justice Hall, to stand where Jasmine had stood, to understand that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in its presence. The linoleum had been replaced, too much blood to ever fully clean, but the new floor bore a mosaic designed by student artists, depicting scales of justice balanced not by a sword, but by a pen. On the 2nd anniversary of the attack, Jasmine returned to Roosevelt High as a speaker, not for a ceremony, but for a regular assembly, talking to students about their rights, about documentation, about the power of saying no to authority when authority is wrong. She still used her cane, still struggled with certain words when her brain couldn't quite connect thought to speech, but her message was clear. "They wanted me to disappear," she told the packed auditorium, looking at faces that could have been hers 2 years ago. Young, hopeful, vulnerable. "They deleted the footage, destroyed the phone, tried to erase the evidence. But I'm still here. We're all still here. And as long as we're here, as long as we remember, as long as we document and testify and refuse to be silent, they can't win." A freshman raised her hand. "Weren't you scared?" Jasmine thought about the question, about the moment Marrow's hand had grabbed her shoulder, about the first strike of the baton, about the weeks of darkness in the coma, about the months of painful recovery. "Every single day," she answered honestly. "I'm scared right now. But my mom taught me something, though she didn't mean to. She taught me that fear can make you silent for 20 years, or it can make you loud enough to shake foundations. The fear doesn't go away. You just decide what to do with it." The assembly ended, but students lingered, wanting to talk, to share their own experiences, to show Jasmine videos they'd taken of police officers in their neighborhoods, at their jobs, in their lives. She watched them all, validated their experiences, reminded them to back up everything, to trust, but verify, to remember that badges don't grant morality any more than hoodies indicate criminality. As she left the school that day, walking slowly through Justice Hall with her mother beside her, Jasmine noticed a new addition to the memorial wall: photographs of other students who'd experienced police violence, some dating back decades, finally given space to be remembered. "Look, Mom," she said, pointing to a faded photo from 1985. "We were never alone. They were just waiting for someone to say it out loud." The photographs on that memorial wall would haunt Jasmine's dreams that night. Faces of children and teenagers spanning 40 years, all carrying the same expression of bewildered pain she'd seen in her own reflection during recovery. She woke at 3 in the morning, her left hand cramping with phantom pain, and found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by old newspapers and police reports. "Couldn't sleep either?" Lorraine asked without looking up from a yellowed article about a 12-year-old boy who'd been choked unconscious by an officer in 1993. The officer's name was circled in red ink: Thomas Merrow. "The walls keep getting fuller," Jasmine said, settling carefully into a chair, her movements still calculated to avoid sudden pain. "Every time someone adds another photo, another story, I realize how many of us there were. How many of us they hurt while everyone stayed quiet." Lorraine pushed a stack of documents toward her daughter. "Foster sent these over. She's been getting them from officers all over the state. Cops who stayed silent for years now suddenly finding their consciences." Her tone carried both hope and bitterness. "Better late than never, I suppose." The documents revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond the Merrow family. Officers who'd fabricated evidence, prosecutors who'd buried exculpatory reports, judges who'd consistently sided with police despite overwhelming evidence of misconduct. It was a machine designed to protect itself, and the Merrows had been just one gear in its mechanism. "We broke one family," Jasmine said quietly, reading through a report about an officer who'd planted drugs on 17 different suspects over 5 years. "But the machine is still running." 3 days later, Alexis Thompson called with news that would change everything again. "The Department of Justice wants to take over. Not just our case, but a complete federal oversight of the entire police department. They're citing systemic constitutional violations going back 30 years. Jasmine listened as Alexis explained the implications: federal monitors, mandatory reforms, millions in damages to victims. It was victory on a scale they'd never imagined when they'd first released those photos of deleted security footage. But victory, Jasmine had learned, came with its own complications. The federal investigation meant depositions, endless depositions. Jasmine spent entire days in sterile conference rooms, recounting her story to different federal agents, each one needing to hear every detail, every moment of those 47 seconds, stretched into hours of testimony. Her brain injury made concentration difficult, and by the end of each session, words would slip away from her like water through damaged fingers. "I need a break," she told one particularly insistent prosecutor after 6 hours of questions. "My brain doesn't work like it used to. I can't just power through anymore." The prosecutor, a young woman named Sarah Chen, Dorothy's niece, as it turned out drawn to justice work by her family's own history with the Merrows, immediately apologized. "Of course. I'm sorry. Sometimes we forget that survival doesn't mean healed." It was during one of these breaks that Jasmine met Anthony Reeves, a 23-year-old who'd been paralyzed from the waist down after an encounter with Officer Nolan Merrow 3 years before Jasmine's attack. He'd been sitting in his wheelchair in the hallway, waiting for his own deposition, when Jasmine emerged exhausted and shaking slightly from the mental strain. "You're Jasmine Mercer," he said, not a question, but recognition. "You're the reason I'm finally getting to tell my story." They talked for 2 hours, comparing scars, both visible and hidden. Anthony had been a basketball player recruited by 3 colleges, until Merrow had thrown him down a flight of stairs during a wellness check that his roommate had called when Anthony was having a mental health crisis. The official report said he'd jumped. The settlement his family received came with a non-disclosure agreement that Jasmine's case had finally allowed him to break. "I watched your testimony against Merrow on the news." Anthony told her. "When you talked about him smiling as he hit you, I started crying. He smiled at me too, right before he pushed me. Like our pain was entertainment." They became friends, then allies, then co-founders of a support group for police violence survivors. They met weekly in the basement of a community center, the gathering growing from 5 people to 15 to 50. Each meeting revealing more stories, more patterns, more evidence of how deep the rot went. Marcus Williams attended every meeting, still carrying the guilt of his failed recording. "I had the evidence," he'd say repeatedly. "If I'd just saved it differently, if I'd been smarter." "Stop," Jasmine told him one evening after he'd spiraled into another self-recrimination session. "You did more than anyone else that day. You tried. The fact that they destroyed your video proves how important it was. They wouldn't have risked obstruction charges for nothing." But Marcus's guilt had transformed into something useful. He'd become an expert in digital security, teaching protesters how to live-stream arrests directly to secure servers, how to encrypt footage, how to ensure that evidence couldn't be destroyed by simply breaking a phone. His Document Everything organization had chapters in 12 cities, now all trained in what he called defensive recording. The federal oversight agreement was signed on a Tuesday morning in July, the same courtroom where Nolan Marrow had been sentenced. Chief of Police Patricia Hawkins, the third chief in 18 months after the previous 2 had resigned in disgrace, stood at the podium reading from prepared remarks about new beginnings and accountability. Jasmine watched from the gallery, noting how Hawkins's hands trembled slightly, how her voice caught on the word reform. This was a woman who'd risen through the ranks of the same corrupted system, who'd worked alongside the Marrows, who'd stayed silent until silence became impossible. Her appointment was supposed to represent change, but Jasmine saw only adaptation, the system trying to preserve itself by sacrificing a few of its own. After the ceremony, Hawkins approached Jasmine and her mother. "Ms. Mercer, Jasmine, I want you to know that things really will be different. I'm committed to—" "Are you?" Jasmine interrupted, her tone not hostile, but genuinely curious. "Because 3 years ago, you were Captain Hawkins working directly under Richard Marrow. Where was your commitment then?" Hawkins' professional mask slipped for a moment, revealing something raw underneath shame, maybe, or fear. "I had to survive in that system to get to a position where I could change it." "My daughter nearly died in that system while you were surviving in it," Lorraine said quietly, and her words carried more weight than any shout could have. "How many others paid for your survival with their blood?" Hawkins had no answer. She walked away, her reform speeches suddenly feeling as hollow as they sounded. That evening, Jasmine found herself back at Roosevelt High, standing in Justice Hall with Ms. Patricia Williams, who'd requested the meeting. The older woman looked tired, older than her years, worn down by fighting a system from within. "I'm retiring," Patricia said simply. 20 years of teaching and I'm done. I can't do it anymore, not after what I saw, what I failed to prevent." "You tried to help," Jasmine reminded her. "You spoke up. Morrison threatened your job, and you still testified." "I should have done more." Patricia's voice broke. "I saw Marrow harassing students for years. Little things, I told myself. Nothing worth risking my career over. But those little things add up, don't they? They create a pattern that ends with you in a coma." She handed Jasmine a box filled with notebooks. "These are my documentation. Every incident I witnessed, every complaint students made that went nowhere, every time Morrison told us to look the other way. I should have released these earlier, but I was a coward. Maybe they'll help with the federal investigation." Jasmine opened one notebook at random, finding entries dating back 15 years. Names, dates, incidents, all meticulously recorded by a teacher who'd seen everything but done too little. It was evidence of complicity through inaction, the kind of passive enablement that allowed officers like the Marrows to thrive. "We all failed you," Patricia said. "The whole system, everyone who knew and stayed quiet. I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between them, insufficient but necessary. Jasmine thought about forgiveness, about the weight of carrying anger, about the difference between individual and systemic responsibility. Patricia Williams hadn't swung the baton, but she'd helped create the silence in which batons could swing without consequence. "Use your retirement to do better," Jasmine finally said. "Teach other teachers how to actually protect students. Write about what you saw. Don't let your guilt be passive too." Summer turned to fall and Jasmine started her second year of community college majoring in legal studies with a minor in journalism. Her brain injury made traditional studying impossible, so she developed new methods, recording lectures to replay at slower speeds using voice-to-text software when writing became too painful, taking breaks every 30 minutes to prevent the crushing headaches that still plagued her. Her professor in constitutional law, Dr. Raymond Foster Sargent, Angela Foster's husband, though Jasmine didn't learn this until later, took particular interest in her perspective. "Ms. Mercer," he said one day after class, "your essay on the Fourth Amendment was brilliant, but I noticed you didn't cite any case law after 2015. "My memory has gaps," Jasmine admitted. "The brain injury. Recent information doesn't always stick. I have to relearn things multiple times before they stay." Dr. Foster nodded thoughtfully. "Then we'll adapt. The law isn't about memorization anyway. It's about understanding principles, seeing patterns, fighting for justice, even when the system is designed for injustice. You already understand that better than most lawyers I know." He became her mentor, helping her develop learning strategies that worked with her disability rather than against it. Under his guidance, she began writing law review articles about police violence against minors, each one meticulously researched and devastatingly argued. Legal scholars started citing her work. This undergraduate with a brain injury, who understood constitutional violations from the inside out. It was during this period that Thomas Merrow died. The patriarch of the family, 73 years old, had a heart attack in his home, surrounded by his remaining family and his memorabilia from 40 years of policing. The obituary in the local paper called him a dedicated public servant and a loving father, making no mention of the dozens of brutality complaints or his son's convictions. Jasmine read about his death while sitting in the courthouse library researching for a paper on qualified immunity. She felt nothing at first, then a strange kind of sadness, not for Thomas Merrow, but for all the people he'd hurt, who would never get to confront him, never get their day in court, never hear him acknowledge what he'd done. "He died thinking he was a hero," she told Anthony during their support group meeting that week. His obituary talks about his service awards, his community involvement. Nothing about the kids he brutalized, the lives he destroyed. "That's how they win," said Maria Santos, whose son had been killed by police 5 years ago. "They write the history. They control the narrative, unless we write louder." So Jasmine wrote louder. She published an op-ed in the national newspaper titled "The Real Legacy of Thomas Merrow," listing every documented victim, every covered-up assault, every life destroyed by his violence, and the violence he taught his sons. The piece went viral, shared millions of times, sparking conversations about how police officers' legacies should be recorded. The Merrow family threatened to sue for defamation, but Alexis Thompson welcomed the challenge. "Please," she said publicly, "let's go to court and examine all the evidence again. I have 40 years of documentation I'd love to enter into the public record." The lawsuit never materialized. Meanwhile, the federal oversight was revealing the depth of the department's corruption. Every week brought new revelations: officers who'd been dealing drugs from evidence lockers, a sex trafficking ring protected by police murders disguised as suicides. The city had to set aside $50 million for settlements, and even that wouldn't be enough. Jasmine testified before Congress when they held hearings on police reform, her cane clicking against the marble floors of the Capitol building. She sat before the Judiciary Committee, C-SPAN cameras broadcasting nationwide, and spoke truth to power with the same clarity she'd shown in that hospital testimony against Nolan Merrow. "Senators," she began, looking at the panel of mostly white, mostly male faces. "You want to talk about bad apples? I'm here to tell you about the orchard. The soil that grows these apples, the water that feeds them, the farmers who cultivate them, knowing exactly what they'll harvest." She spoke for 30 minutes without notes. Her memory might have gaps, but her lived experience was crystalline. She talked about the blue wall of silence, the qualified immunity that protected violent officers, the union contracts that made accountability impossible, the prosecutors who wouldn't prosecute the judges who wouldn't convict. Officer Nolan Marrow didn't wake up one day and decide to beat a 16-year-old unconscious, she said. He was trained for it, encouraged in it, protected after it. His violence was systemic, generational, institutional. Until you address that, you're just playing whack-a-mole with individual officers while the machine keeps producing more. Senator Patricia Chen. Dorothy's daughter, inspired by her brother's story and Jasmine's courage to run for office, asked the question that would define the hearings. Ms. Mercer, what would real justice look like to you? Jasmine thought about the question, about her damaged hand and her damaged brain, about the nightmares that still woke her, about all the other Jasmines whose stories had never been told. Justice would be never having been attacked in the first place, she said. But since we can't undo the past, justice would be ensuring it never happens again. Not to anyone's child in any hallway in any city. Justice would be a world where wearing a hood on a cold day doesn't end with brain surgery. The hearing room was silent. Senator Chen wiped her eyes, not caring that the cameras caught her tears. After the hearings, Jasmine was approached by a publisher who wanted her to expand her memoir to include everything that had happened since the attack. She agreed, but with conditions half the proceeds would go to police violence survivors, and the book would include a comprehensive appendix of resources for documentation, legal aid, and support groups. Writing the expanded edition took a year, partly because of her disability, partly because reliving the trauma required weekly therapy sessions to process. Dr. Jennifer Martinez. Her therapist specialized in trauma from state violence and had her own history with police brutality. Her brother had been killed during a traffic stop 15 years ago. Trauma rewires the brain, Dr. Martinez explained during one session when Jasmine was frustrated by her inability to remember certain details. Your brain is protecting you from the full weight of what happened. The memories are there, but accessing them safely takes time. Sometimes I feel like I'm two different people, Jasmine admitted. The girl before the attack and whoever I am now. I mourn who I was, who I could have been. That's not uncommon, Dr. Martinez said gently. Trauma creates a before and after. But you're not two people, you're one person who survived something unsurvivable. The girl who wanted to be a doctor and the woman fighting for justice are the same person, just shaped by different experiences. The therapy helped, but healing wasn't linear. Some days Jasmine felt strong, powerful, ready to change the world. Other days, the simple act of seeing a police car would send her into a panic attack, her body remembering the impact of Marrow's baton even when her mind tried to stay calm. It was on one of her bad days that she received a letter that would shift her perspective. It came from David Marrow, not the prosecutor's son, but Nolan Marrow himself, writing from federal prison. She almost threw it away unread, but curiosity won. The letter was short, written in cramped handwriting on prison stationery. Ms. Mercer, I know I have no right to contact you. My lawyer says I shouldn't write this, but I need you to know something. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But you should know that your testimony, your courage, it changed things in here too. Other inmates, some of them cops, they're starting to talk about what they did, why they did it. You started something bigger than just my conviction. I'm in therapy now, mandatory, but I'm actually participating. I'm trying to understand why I became what my father raised me to be. It's not an excuse, just an explanation. I was the weapon, but someone else loaded the gun. You broke the cycle. My son, he's 8 now, he'll grow up different because of what you did. That's all I wanted to say. I'm sorry for everything. Nolan Marrow. Jasmine read the letter 3 times, then showed it to her mother. Do you believe him? Lorraine asked. I don't know, Jasmine admitted. Maybe. Does it matter he's serving 25 years either way? But his son, that matters. Another 8-year-old who won't be taught that violence is strength, that badges grant the right to brutalize. She didn't respond to the letter, but she kept it filed away with all the other documentation of her journey. It became a reminder that change happened in ways both visible and invisible, that breaking cycles of violence created ripples even in maximum security prisons. The letter from Nolan Marrow sat in Jasmine's desk drawer for weeks, a strange weight that pulled at her thoughts during quiet moments. She found herself thinking about his 8-year-old son, growing up with a father in federal prison, carrying the burden of a surname that had become synonymous with police brutality. One evening, while reviewing case files with Alexis Thompson, she brought it up. "His son didn't choose to be a Marrow," Jasmine said, staring at a photograph from the trial that showed Nolan being led away in handcuffs. "What happens to him now? Does he grow up hating me for putting his father away? Or does he grow up hating his father for what he did?" Alexis set down her pen, considering the question. Children of convicted officers often face their own trauma. They're ostracized at school, torn between loyalty to family and recognition of wrongdoing. Some repeat the cycle trying to restore family honor. Others break free entirely. That conversation stayed with Jasmine as she prepared for her next speaking engagement at Columbia Law School. The invitation had come from their criminal justice reform clinic, and she'd accepted partly because of the platform, partly because she wanted to see if she could handle the academic environment she'd once dreamed of joining as a pre-med student. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity, students sitting in aisles and standing against walls. Jasmine approached the podium slowly, her cane a rhythmic counterpoint to the sudden silence. She'd learned to use these moments, the visible reminder of her injury, to set the tone for what would follow. "4 years ago, I wanted to be a doctor." She began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I had a 4.0 GPA, perfect attendance, and a plan for my life that stretched out neat and orderly like a surgical suture. Then, Officer Nolan Marrow decided I was wearing my hood too defiantly, and suddenly I became a different kind of case study." A student in the front row was recording on her phone, and Jasmine noticed the slight shake in the girl's hands. "You can record," Jasmine said directly to her. "Document everything. That's the first lesson. But make sure you're backing it up to the cloud in real time. The second lesson is that evidence has a tendency to disappear when police are involved." The presentation lasted 2 hours, including questions that ranged from legal theory to personal trauma. One professor asked about qualified immunity, and Jasmine's response drew from both her lived experience and the extensive legal research she'd done with Dr. Foster. Qualified immunity assumes officers should be protected unless they violate clearly established rights, she explained. But how does a right become clearly established if officers are always immune from consequences? It's a circular logic that protects violence. Officer Marrow knew he wouldn't face consequences because officers before him hadn't. The system doesn't just allow abuse, it encourages it through guaranteed protection. After the lecture, a young man approached her, nervous and clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. He was tall, athletic build, with the kind of careful posture that suggested military or police training. "Ms. Mercer," he said quietly, "my name is James Hutchinson. Derek Hutchinson is my brother." Jasmine tensed, her hand tightening on her cane. She hadn't heard that name in months, had tried not to think about the officer who'd stood by while Marrow attacked her, who'd helped destroy the evidence. "I know you probably hate him," James continued quickly. "You have every right to. But I wanted you to know that testifying at your trial turning on Marrow, it destroyed him in ways that needed destroying. He's in therapy now. Real therapy, not the department's cover-your-ass counseling. He talks about you a lot, about the courage it took to stand up when he couldn't. He made a choice," Jasmine said carefully, not sure why she was even engaging with this conversation. "He did, the wrong one, and he knows that. He's working with your friend Marcus now, teaching police recruits about bystander responsibility, about what happens when good cops stay silent. He uses his shame as a teaching tool." James pulled out a card. "This is his number. He won't call you, he says he doesn't have that right. But if you ever want to talk to understand why he did nothing, he owes you that explanation." Jasmine took the card but made no promises. The weight of it in her pocket felt heavier than paper should as she made her way to the train station, accompanied by Anthony Reeves, who'd come to support her presentation. "Would you talk to him?" Anthony asked as they settled into their seats for the ride home. "I don't know. Part of me wants to understand how someone can watch a child being beaten and just stand there. Part of me thinks understanding might make me hate him less, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that." Anthony nodded, adjusting his wheelchair in the designated space. "I've been thinking about forgiveness a lot lately. Not for them, but for us. Carrying hate is exhausting. But letting it go feels like betrayal of what we suffered." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the other end of the train car. Two transit officers were confronting a teenager, maybe 14, for allegedly jumping the turnstile. The boy was trying to explain something, pulling out what looked like a student Metro card, but the officers weren't listening. One had his hand on his baton. Jasmine and Anthony exchanged a look, then both pulled out their phones simultaneously. Jasmine started recording while Anthony began live streaming, narrating quietly but clearly. Two transit officers, badge numbers 4782 and 3691, confronting a minor without parent or guardian present, Anthony said into his phone. "The youth is attempting to show documentation. Officer 4782 has hand on weapon." Other passengers began recording too, a forest of phones rising like witnesses. The officers noticed their aggressive postures shifting as they realized they were being documented from multiple angles. "Everyone recording needs to stop," Officer 4782 said, but his voice lacked conviction. The crowd of phones didn't waver. "Public space, public servants, public right to record," Jasmine said loudly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd memorized every relevant law. "Turner v. Driver, 5th Circuit, 2017. We have the right to record police activity in public spaces." The officer's face reddened, but his partner, older and apparently wiser, put a hand on his arm. "Let's just write the citation and go," he muttered. They issued the teenager a warning, not even a citation, and left at the next stop. The boy, visibly shaken, thanked everyone who'd recorded before hurrying off the train. Jasmine watched him go, remembering herself at 16, believing that following rules would keep you safe. "That's the change," Anthony said quietly. 4 years ago, nobody would have recorded. Or if they did, they'd have been alone. Now look, 20 phones, instant accountability. But accountability, Jasmine knew, was still inconsistent. For every incident caught on camera, dozens happened in spaces without witnesses, in back rooms of precincts, in isolated cells where screams couldn't be heard. The machine had been wounded, not destroyed. This reality was reinforced the next week when Lorraine called Jasmine from the hospital, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They brought in a kid today, 15 years old, said he fell downstairs at the precinct. Same injuries you had: head trauma, broken ribs, damaged hand." "Which precinct?" "Northeast, Captain Richard Merrow's old command." Jasmine felt the familiar surge of rage and purpose. Richard Merrow was in prison. Nolan too, but their legacy lived on in officers. They'd trained policies, they'd implemented cultures they'd created. She arrived at the hospital within an hour, finding the boy Carlos Mendez unconscious in the same ICU where she'd spent weeks. His mother Rosa was holding his hand, whispering prayers in Spanish. "Mrs. Mendez," Jasmine approached carefully. "I'm Jasmine Mercer. I heard about Carlos." Rosa looked up, recognition dawning through her tears. "You're the girl who fought them. Who won?" "I survived," Jasmine corrected gently. "Winning would have been not getting attacked at all. Can you tell me what happened?" The story was familiar in its brutality. Carlos had been accused of stealing from a corner store, though the owner later said he'd made no such complaint. The officers had taken him to the precinct for questioning. 3 hours later, he was brought to the hospital with injuries consistent with a severe beating, though the official report claimed he'd attacked officers and fallen during the struggle. "They think because we're undocumented we won't fight back," Rosa whispered. They think we'll stay quiet." "You don't have to stay quiet," Jasmine said firmly. "Your immigration status doesn't remove your constitutional rights. Your son was brutalized by police, and that's a federal crime regardless of citizenship." She called Alexis Thompson from the hospital lobby, then Marcus Williams, then Angela Foster, who was now working as a consultant for the federal oversight team. Within hours, a team was assembled, lawyers, activists, investigators, all drawn by the pattern that seemed too familiar to ignore. The investigation revealed that the Northeast Precinct had developed its own version of the Marrow methodology. Young officers were being blooded, a term they actually used in text messages, by beating suspects who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. Undocumented immigrants were preferred targets because they rarely filed complaints. "It's like cutting off a hydra's head," Alexis said during a strategy meeting in her office. "Remove one marrow, two more appear. The system regenerates its corruption." "Then we burn the whole system," Jasmine replied, exhaustion making her more radical than usual. "Not reform, replacement. Build something new." The words hung in the air, dangerous and necessary. Everyone in the room, survivors, lawyers, activists, knew that reform had been tried for decades. Consent decrees, federal oversight, body cameras, implicit bias training. Yet here they were, in the same cycle, with a new generation of Carlos Mendezes lying broken in hospital beds. The strategy that emerged was both radical and practical. Instead of just documenting abuse after it happened, they would create alternative response systems. Mental health professionals for wellness checks instead of armed officers. Community mediation for disputes. Youth counselors for school discipline. They would make the police irrelevant rather than reformed. Jasmine threw herself into this work using her growing platform to advocate for these alternatives. She spoke at city council meetings, wrote op-eds, appeared on national news programs. Her brain injury made each appearance exhausting, requiring days of recovery, but she pushed through. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of testimony at a city budget hearing, arguing for funding community programs over police expansion, she found herself sitting in her childhood bedroom, overwhelmed by the weight of being a symbol. Her mother found her there crying quietly while holding her high school yearbook. "I just wanted to go to college," Jasmine said through her tears. "I wanted to be normal. I wanted to complain about organic chemistry and stay up too late studying and have my biggest worry be getting into med school." Lorraine sat beside her daughter, pulling her close. "I know, baby. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Sorry that you had to become this warrior when you should have just been a kid. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing any good, or if I'm just screaming into the void. Carlos Mendez is still in a coma. They're still beating children. What's the point of all this fighting if nothing really changes?" Her mother was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the wisdom of someone who'd lived through decades of incremental progress and devastating setbacks. "Change isn't a lightning strike, Jasmine. It's erosion. Every time you speak, every time someone records, every time a Carlos Mendez gets justice instead of silence, we wear away at the mountain. You might not live to see it become a valley, but your children will walk on lower ground because of your work." The next morning brought unexpected news. Derek Hutchinson had released a book, not a memoir, but a training manual for police officers titled The Bystander's Burden, A Cop's Guide to Intervention. All proceeds were going to Jasmine's Survivor Fund. The dedication read, "To Jasmine Mercer, who stood up when I stood by, and to all the officers reading this, be better than I was." Jasmine read excerpts online, finding detailed scenarios based on real incidents, psychological insights into why officers fail to intervene, and practical strategies for overcoming the bystander effect. It was unflinching in its self-criticism, naming his own cowardice without excuse. She thought about the card in her desk drawer, James Hutchinson's number. After a week of deliberation, she called. Derek Hutchinson answered on the second ring, his voice uncertain. "Ms. Mercer, I read your book," she said without preamble. "Well, parts of it. He started, then stopped. "Thank you for calling. I know I don't deserve— You're right, you don't, Jasmine interrupted. But I need to understand something. In that moment when Marrow was beating me, what were you thinking? Really thinking? The silence stretched long enough that Jasmine wondered if he'd hung up. Then quietly, I was thinking about my mortgage, my daughter's tuition, my father's medical bills. I was thinking that Marrow had connections and I didn't. I was thinking that you were just one girl and my whole family depended on my job. I was thinking like a coward who valued his comfort over a child's life. The honesty was brutal, uglier than any excuse would have been. And now? Jasmine asked. Now I think about you every day, about the sound your head made hitting the locker, about your mother's face at the hospital, about how many other Jasmines I let get hurt because I was protecting myself. I can't undo it, but I can spend whatever years I have left making sure other officers don't make my choice. Your book, Jasmine said slowly, it could help, but only if it's mandatory reading at academies, not just something gathering dust on shelves. I'm working on that, meeting with training directors' union representatives. Most don't want to hear it, but some do. The younger ones especially, they're different. They grew up seeing the videos, the protests. They don't want to be us. After the call, Jasmine felt strange, not forgiveness exactly, but a shift in the weight she carried. Derek Hutchinson would live with his shame forever, but he was using it as fuel for change. Maybe that was its own form of justice. Carlos Mendez woke up 3 weeks after his attack, his injuries less severe than Jasmine's, but still life-altering. She visited him regularly, teaching him the exercises that had helped her regain motor function, sharing the contact information for therapists who understood trauma from state violence. They think I'm going to disappear, Carlos told her one afternoon, struggling through physical therapy exercises. Go back to El Salvador because I'm scared. But I was born here. This is my country too. Then we fight for it, Jasmine said, steadying his arm as he worked through the movements. Together. The case against Carlos's attackers moved faster than Jasmine's had, partly because of the infrastructure now in place, partly because the federal oversight team was actively investigating. 3 officers were arrested within a month, their text messages about blooding rookies becoming evidence of conspiracy. But for every victory, there were setbacks. A city council vote to redirect police funding to mental health services failed by 1 vote. A promising recruit to the community response team was arrested on old warrants that mysteriously resurfaced. Marcus Williams's documentation training was banned from schools after police union pressure. The work was exhausting, Sisyphean, pushing boulders up mountains, only to watch them roll back down. Jasmine's health suffered the stress-triggered seizures related to her brain injury, requiring medication adjustments and periods of forced rest that made her feel like she was failing the movement she'd helped create. During one of these forced breaks, she received an unexpected visitor. Patricia Chen. Now Senator Chen arrived at the Mercer home with a security detail and a proposal. I'm introducing federal legislation, the senator explained, sitting in the same kitchen where Lorraine had documented police corruption years before. The Jasmine Mercer Act. It would eliminate qualified immunity for cases involving minors, require federal investigation of any police violence against children, and create a national database of officers with brutality complaints. You know it won't pass, Jasmine said realistically. Not with the current Congress. Not this session, no. But we introduce it, we build support, we make them vote against protecting children. Sometimes losing strategically is its own victory. The legislation was introduced with great fanfare. Jasmine testified again, Carlos Mendez beside her. Anthony Reeves behind them, a living tableau of police violence consequences. The opposition was predictable, police unions claiming it would make officers unable to do their jobs. Conservatives warning about rising crime, the usual chorus that prioritized order over justice. But something had shifted in the public conversation. Parents who'd never thought about police violence were seeing Jasmine, seeing Carlos, seeing children who looked like their own kids broken by those sworn to protect them. The bill didn't pass, but it got 43 Senate votes, far more than anyone had expected. Erosion, Lorraine reminded Jasmine that night as they watched the vote on C-SPAN. The mountain is wearing down. The third anniversary of Jasmine's attack arrived with unexpected media attention. News crews wanted to film at Roosevelt High to capture the triumph over tragedy narrative they'd constructed. Jasmine refused them all, choosing instead to spend the day with the support group now grown to over 100 members. They met in a church basement, circles of folding chairs filled with people whose lives had been fractured by police violence. There was no media, no speeches, just survivors sharing space and understanding. Carlos was there walking without assistance now. Anthony led a discussion about adaptive technologies for those with permanent injuries. Parents of children who hadn't survived shared their memories. 3 years ago, I was just a kid worried about a chemistry test, Jasmine told the group. I didn't choose this fight. None of us did. But here we are, still standing, still fighting, still refusing to be silenced. That's its own form of victory. After the meeting, she found herself walking through Roosevelt High's halls with Principal Morrison's replacement, Dr. Angela Washington, a black woman who'd specifically requested the position after Jasmine's case. We've changed everything, Dr. Washington said, showing Jasmine the new conflict resolution room, where trained counselors worked with students. No police presence, restorative justice practices, mental health support. Your sacrifice made this possible. It wasn't a sacrifice, Jasmine corrected, running her hand along the wall where she'd been slammed. A sacrifice is voluntary. What happened to me was theft. They stole my future, my health, my innocence. We're not building on sacrifice, we're building on survival. Dr. Washington's words echoed in Jasmine's mind as she left Roosevelt High that afternoon, the distinction between sacrifice and survival feeling particularly sharp. That evening, she received a call that would test that survival in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was Alexis Thompson, her voice unusually tense. Jasmine, I need you to sit down for this. David Merrow, the prosecutor Nolan's brother, he's filed a civil suit. He's claiming defamation, emotional distress, and loss of career opportunities because of your public statements about the Merrow family. Jasmine laughed, but it was bitter hollow. He's suing me. His father and brother are in prison for brutality, and he's claiming I hurt his career. It's an intimidation tactic. He knows he can't win, but he can drain our resources, force you to spend time in depositions instead of advocacy. It's meant to silence you. But silence was no longer in Jasmine's vocabulary. Within hours, she'd composed a response that she posted across all her social media platforms, documenting David Merrow's own history cases, where he'd declined to prosecute police brutality instances, where he'd suppressed evidence favorable to defendants, a pattern of protecting the system that had protected his family. The response went viral, but it came with a cost. Death threats increased now, including specific details about her daily routine that suggested surveillance. Federal agents recommended she vary her routes, consider protection, maybe even relocate temporarily. The thought of being driven from her home by the Merrows, even now, made her physically ill. They're still trying to win, she told her mother that night after installing new security cameras around their house. Even from prison, even through lawsuits, they're still trying to break us. Lorraine was checking the locks on windows, a new nightly ritual. Then we keep not breaking. That's how we win, by still being here tomorrow. Tomorrow came with unexpected allies. A group of former police officers, all who'd left the force after witnessing brutality they couldn't stop, reached out through Angela Foster. They wanted to create a documentary telling their stories of why they'd quit what they'd seen, why the system couldn't be reformed from within. Jasmine met them in a neutral location, a community center, in a different neighborhood, everyone nervous about being seen together. There were 5 of them, ranging from a 20-year veteran to someone who'd lasted only 6 months on the force. I watched my partner plant drugs on a kid, said the youngest, Sarah, who'd quit after 6 months. When I reported it, I was told I misunderstood what I'd seen. When I insisted, I started getting the worst shifts, the most dangerous calls without backup. They didn't fire me. They tried to get me killed. Each story was a variation on the same theme: officers who'd tried to maintain integrity in a system that punished honesty and rewarded violence. They'd all paid prices for their conscience, lost pensions, blacklisting from security jobs, threats against their families. "We want to testify," the veteran Robert said, "not in court, but to the public. Let people understand that good cops don't last because the system is designed to eliminate us or corrupt us." The documentary project began immediately with Jasmine serving as both interviewer and subject. Her brain injury made long filming days impossible, so they worked in short sessions building the narrative slowly. Marcus Williams brought his technical expertise, ensuring everything was backed up in triplicate, encrypted, and secure. During a break in filming, Sarah pulled Jasmine aside. "There's something else. David Merrow, the prosecutor, he's not just filing lawsuits. He's been meeting with officers still on the force, organizing something. I still have friends inside, they're scared." "Organizing what?" "They call it restoration. Getting things back to how they were before your case, before the federal oversight. They're planning something for the anniversary." The 4th anniversary of Jasmine's attack was 2 weeks away. She shared the information with Alexis and Angela Foster, who took it to the federal oversight team. Security was increased around Jasmine and other visible activists. But the threat felt different this time, not random violence, but coordinated resistance. The anniversary arrived gray and cold weather that matched the mood. Roosevelt High had planned no official commemoration at Jasmine's request, but students had organized their own remembrance. They wore purple hoodies and stood in silent protest in Justice Hall during passing periods. Jasmine watched from Dr. Washington's office, not trusting herself to be in that hallway without breaking down. Through the window, she could see news vans gathering, drawn by rumors of the restoration plan. Everyone was waiting for something to happen. It came at noon. Dozens of off-duty officers, some retired, others on suspension, gathered outside the school. They wore shirts with Thomas Merrow's badge number, carried signs reading, "Support our police," and "Justice for the Merrows." David Merrow stood at their front, speaking through a bullhorn about the war on police and the persecution of heroes. Counter-protesters arrived within minutes: students, parents, survivors from Jasmine's support group. The two crowds faced each other across the street, separated by a thin line of on-duty officers who looked deeply uncomfortable with their position. Jasmine made a decision that Lorraine tried to stop. She walked out of the school slowly, deliberately, her cane clicking against the concrete. The crowd quieted as she approached, all eyes on her measured steps toward David Merrow. She stopped 10 feet from him, close enough to be heard, without shouting. "Your father broke my pregnant mother's arm 20 years ago. Your brother put me in a coma 4 years ago. And now you're here at the site of my trauma, claiming your family are the victims." David Merrow's face was red. Whether from anger or shame was unclear. "My family served this city for generations." "Your family terrorized this city for generations," Jasmine interrupted. "And you know it. You've seen the files, the complaints, the cover-ups. You know exactly what your father and brother were. But admitting that would mean admitting your whole life was built on other people's pain." The crowd was recording everything, phones held high like witnesses. David tried to respond, but Jasmine wasn't finished. "You want restoration to go back to when officers could beat children without consequence, when complaints disappeared and cameras malfunctioned, when families like mine knew to stay quiet or face worse." She gestured to the school behind her. "That world is gone. We destroyed it, and we'll destroy anyone who tries to rebuild it." The threat in her words was not physical, but systemic: legal challenges, public exposure, the tireless work of documentation and testimony. David Merrow seemed to shrink before it, his supporters' chants growing quieter. Then Carlos Mendez stepped forward from the counter-protest crowd, still walking carefully, but without assistance. "Mr. Merrow, I was 15 when your brother's trainees nearly killed me. 15. I missed my sophomore year recovering. Is that the restoration you want?" One by one, other survivors stepped forward, stating their names, ages when attacked, injuries sustained. The litany of violence was overwhelming, undeniable, each testimony a weight added to the scale of justice. David Merrow's supporters began to drift away, their signs lowering their chants, dying. Finally, David stood alone, except for a small core of hardcore supporters. He looked at Jasmine with something that might have been hatred, or might have been recognition of defeat. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The last gasps of the Merrow dynasty's power dissipating in the cold afternoon air. But victory felt hollow to Jasmine. David Merrow would go back to his law practice, his comfortable life built on his family's violent legacy. The officers who'd rallied to him would return to their jobs or their retirements. The system that had created the Merrows still existed, wounded, but not dead. That night, unable to sleep, Jasmine found herself writing. Not legal briefs or op-eds, but something more personal. She wrote about the girl she'd been before the attack, the dreams that had been broken, the future that had been stolen. She wrote about the strange gratitude she sometimes felt for the clarity trauma had brought, the understanding of systemic violence that comfort would never have taught her. "I hate that this happened to me," she wrote, "but I can't hate who it's made me become. I was going to be a doctor healing individual bodies. Instead, I'm trying to heal a diseased system. The scope is bigger, even if the tools are blunter." The writing became part of her new book, but it also became something more, a reckoning with herself, with the movement that had formed around her, with the question of what victory actually looked like in a war against systemic oppression. A week later, she received news that shifted her perspective again. Nolan Merrow had been attacked in prison, severely beaten by other inmates who'd apparently decided that child abusers deserved their own justice. He'd survived, but would need months of recovery, might never walk properly again. Jasmine felt nothing at first, then a complicated mix of emotions she couldn't name. She didn't celebrate his pain, but she didn't mourn it either. It was just another violence in an endless cycle of violence, one that wouldn't end with individual punishments, but only with systemic change. She visited him, a decision that shocked everyone, including herself. The federal prison was 2 hours away, a concrete monument to society's failures. Nolan Merrow was in the medical wing, handcuffed to his bed despite his injuries, his face swollen almost beyond recognition. "Why are you here?" he asked through split lips. "I don't know," Jasmine admitted. "Maybe to see if you've learned anything. Maybe to see if you're still the monster from that hallway." He was quiet for a long moment. "I think about it every day. Not because I'm in here, but because I have a son, 8 years old, and I imagine someone doing to him what I did to you, and I want to kill them. And then I realize that someone is me." "Your son doesn't have to be you," Jasmine said. "That cycle can end with him." How his father's in prison for brutality, his grandfather died unrepentant, his uncle's still trying to restore what we lost. What chance does he have? The same chance I had to choose differently when the moment comes. To wear his hood on a cold day without fear. To stand up to authority when authority is wrong. To be better than what came before. She left without saying goodbye, but she'd gotten what she came for, the understanding that Nolan Merrow was both monster and human, both perpetrator and product of perpetration. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained why individual punishment would never be enough. The documentary premiered 3 months later at a film festival that typically showcased entertainment rather than activism. But the stories of the former officers intercut with Jasmine's journey, and the survivors' testimonies created something more powerful than propaganda. It created understanding. The most powerful moment came from Robert, the 20-year veteran, describing the moment he'd decided to quit. "I was training a rookie good kid, idealistic. We responded to a shoplifting call. A kid maybe 12 had stolen food. I was going to let him go with a warning, but my partner started roughing him up. The rookie looked at me, waiting for me to intervene, and I didn't. I saw myself becoming what I'd sworn I'd never be, a coward who let children be hurt. I quit that night." The documentary won awards, gained national distribution, became required viewing in some police academies despite union protests. But more importantly, it gave language to something people had felt but couldn't articulate. That police violence wasn't about individual bad actors, but about systems that created, enabled, and protected those actors. David Merrow's lawsuit proceeded through the courts with the grinding slowness of civil litigation. Depositions, motions, countermotions, all designed to exhaust rather than resolve. Jasmine spent countless hours in lawyers' offices, repeating her story to hostile attorneys who tried to twist her words, find contradictions, paint her as the aggressor in her own brutalization. During one particularly brutal deposition, David Merrow's attorney showed her a photo from before the attack. Jasmine, at a Black Lives Matter protest the previous year, holding a sign reading, "Police the Police." "Doesn't this show pre-existing anti-police bias?" the attorney pressed. "It shows pre-existing awareness that police needed oversight," Jasmine responded. Which my case proved correct. Unless you're arguing that wearing a hood deserves a skull fracture, my opinion of police is irrelevant to whether Officer Merrow's violence was justified. The attorney had no response that wouldn't make his client's position look worse. It was during these depositions that Jasmine met Amy Chen, no relation to Dorothy or Patricia, just another Chen in a city full of them. Amy was a court reporter silently transcribing every word. But during a break, she approached Jasmine. "My daughter goes to Roosevelt now," Amy said quietly. "She's safe there because of what you did. The counselors, the mediation, the absence of police. She has anxiety, and she'd never have survived the old system. I just wanted you to know that." These moments sustained Jasmine through the grinding legal process, reminders that change had happened, lives had been improved, futures had been saved. The mountain was eroding, even if she couldn't always see it through the fog of daily struggle. The judge in David Merrow's case finally ruled on summary judgment, dismissing most of the claims. Only the defamation charge survived, and barely. The trial would proceed, but on much narrower grounds than David had hoped. His attorney withdrew shortly after, replaced by someone less prestigious, less expensive, signs that even David's supporters were losing faith. Meanwhile, the federal oversight of the police department was revealing more rot. Officers were arrested almost weekly, some for recent crimes, others for cold cases, suddenly warm with new evidence. The department was hemorrhaging members, some fired, others quitting before they could be investigated. The police union, once untouchable, was fracturing between old guard who wanted to fight and younger officers who wanted to distance themselves from the past. Jasmine watched it all with mixed feelings. The system that had nearly killed her was dying, but nothing coherent was replacing it. Crime rates fluctuated wildly as police either over-responded or under-responded to calls, unable to find balance without the old brutal certainties. Community programs were overwhelmed, underfunded, unprepared for the scope of need. "We tore down the house," she told Anthony during one of their regular coffee meetings, both of them watching news coverage of the latest police scandal. "But we haven't built the new one yet. People are getting wet in the rain." "Better wet than beaten," Anthony replied, but his tone suggested he understood her concern. The solution came from an unexpected source, Dr. Washington at Roosevelt High. She'd been documenting the success of their police-free model and proposed expanding it city-wide, creating a network of community response teams trained in de-escalation, mental health intervention, and restorative justice. "We've proven it works," she told a packed city council meeting where Jasmine testified in support. "Zero violent incidents at Roosevelt since we removed police. Disciplinary issues down 60%. Academic performance up across all demographics. What we did from necessity after Jasmine's case, we can do from intention everywhere." The proposal faced massive resistance. Police unions threatened strikes. Conservative media painted it as anarchism. Some community members, especially in wealthy neighborhoods, demanded their protection remain unchanged. But Jasmine had learned something about pressure points. She organized survivors to testify at every council meeting. She brought parents whose children had been saved by Roosevelt's new system. She presented data, statistics, irrefutable evidence that violence decreased when police weren't present to escalate. The vote was scheduled for a Tuesday night in September, almost 5 years to the day since Jasmine's attack. The council chambers were packed beyond capacity, overflow crowds watching on screens in the lobby. Jasmine sat in the front row, her mother on one side, Carlos Mendez on the other, surrounded by survivors who'd become family through shared trauma. Councilmember Patricia Foster, Angela's sister-in-law, recently elected on a reform platform, presented the motion. The debate lasted 4 hours, sometimes heated, sometimes deeply personal. One council member talked about his own son's encounter with police. Another worried about her business district's safety. When the vote was called, it passed 5-4.